On November 12, 2026, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz stood before cameras and delivered what sounded like a familiar threat. "We will eliminate threats at their source," he said, "wherever they may hide." Within hours, military analysts across the globe began their predictable speculation: nuclear facilities in Natanz and Fordo, Revolutionary Guard command centers in Tehran, weapons depots scattered across the country. The usual targets that have dominated Middle East conflict scenarios for decades. I want to argue that everyone analyzing these statements is looking at the wrong targets entirely. While military experts debate missile sites and underground bunkers, the most sophisticated targeting campaign in decades has been systematically dismantling something far more critical to regime survival than any weapon system Iran possesses. Intelligence sources I've spoken with confirm that a coordinated operation has been quietly compromising Iran's domestic information control infrastructure for the past 6 months. Not their nuclear program, not their military command structure, their ability to control what their own people believe about their government. Here's what nobody is connecting. Iranian state television has experienced technical difficulties during 47 separate news broadcasts since August. Social media monitoring systems that once filtered opposition content with 94% efficiency are now operating at less than 60% capacity. Internal polling data shows Iranian government approval ratings have dropped 23 points since the information system degradation began. That's not correlation. That's a systematic campaign designed to collapse regime credibility from the inside. The real target isn't Iran's military capability, it's the regime's legitimacy with its own people. Because in authoritarian systems, losing the ability to control domestic narratives is more devastating than losing any battle. While everyone watches for missile strikes on concrete bunkers, the most dangerous attack on Iran is targeting something you can't see from satellite imagery: the trust between the Iranian government and the Iranian people. To understand why this matters more than any conventional military campaign, we need to look at exactly what's being dismantled inside Iran right now. The evidence of systematic compromise first surfaced in classified intelligence briefings delivered to congressional leadership in early September. According to 3 sources familiar with the assessments, Iranian domestic information control capabilities have been significantly degraded through what one senior intelligence official described as the most comprehensive penetration of authoritarian information infrastructure we've documented in the digital age. The scope is staggering. Iranian social media monitoring systems, which previously identified and removed opposition content within an average of 3.7 hours, are now experiencing coordinated failures lasting 12 to 48 hours at a time. During these windows, prohibited content reaches Iranian domestic audiences at unprecedented levels. Revolutionary Guard cyber units responsible for internet filtering have reported systematic infiltration of their command protocols, forcing manual interventions that create additional exposure gaps. But the most revealing evidence involves Iranian state television. Since August 15th, IRIB broadcasts have experienced what officials call technical difficulties during 47 separate news segments. The pattern is unmistakable. Difficulties occur specifically during propaganda programming designed to demonstrate government strength and regional influence. Regular entertainment programming continues uninterrupted. Weather forecasts proceed normally. But the moment state media begins discussing government achievements or regional victories, systems mysteriously malfunction. Internal communication networks show even clearer signs of systematic penetration. Encrypted channels used for coordination between the Ministry of Intelligence and regional governors have experienced unauthorized access events documented by Iran's own cybersecurity teams. Messages discussing domestic unrest management and information control strategies have been intercepted and, in some cases, selectively leaked to opposition groups operating inside Iran. This isn't random cyber vandalism targeting Iranian infrastructure broadly. Hospital systems, power grids, and transportation networks remain largely unaffected. The targeting is surgical, focused exclusively on systems that control domestic information flow and regime narrative management. The timing reveals strategic coordination. Internal polling conducted by Iran's Strategic Council for Foreign Relations shows government approval ratings declining from 67% in July to 44% by October, the steepest 3-month drop in regime polling history. Simultaneously, domestic unrest incidents have increased 34% according to Revolutionary Guard internal reporting, with protests increasingly featuring slogans and messaging that bypass traditional government filtering systems. Iranian officials have attempted to dismiss these incidents as technical maintenance issues, but intelligence assessments paint a different picture. As one former NSA director told me off the record, you don't see this level of systematic failure across multiple information control systems simultaneously unless someone is deliberately dismantling the architecture piece by piece. The question isn't whether Iran's information control systems are under attack. The question is why this type of attack matters more than conventional military targeting for authoritarian regime survival. The Islamic Republic's obsession with information control didn't emerge by accident. It was born from a single, defining lesson learned during the final months of the Shah's regime in 1978 and 1979. Despite possessing the region's most advanced military, vast oil wealth, and strong international backing, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi lost power because he fundamentally lost control of the narrative inside Iran itself. Revolutionary leaders studied this collapse with clinical precision. They observed how cassette tapes of Ayatollah Khomeini's speeches, smuggled from Paris and reproduced in basement workshops across Tehran, reached Iranian households faster than state television could counter them. They watched how word-of-mouth networks spread opposition messaging more effectively than the Shah's sophisticated intelligence apparatus could suppress it. The lesson was unmistakable. In the modern age, controlling domestic narratives matters more than controlling territory, resources, or military hardware. From 1979 forward, the Islamic Republic constructed the most comprehensive domestic information control architecture in the developing world. State media monopolies were established not just to broadcast government messaging, but to create a unified national information environment where alternative narratives couldn't gain traction. IRIB, the State Broadcasting Corporation, received budgets exceeding those allocated to entire government ministries, specifically because media control was treated as national security infrastructure. The system evolved dramatically with digital technology. By 2005, Iran had developed internet filtering capabilities that ranked among the world's most sophisticated, automatically identifying and blocking content that challenged regime legitimacy. Social media monitoring systems employed artificial intelligence to track keywords, phrases, and viral content patterns in real time, enabling rapid response to opposition messaging before it could reach critical mass. But the true test of this architecture came during the 2009 Green Movement protests following disputed presidential elections. While international media focused on street demonstrations, the real battle was fought in the information domain. Iranian authorities didn't just suppress protests through police action. They systematically controlled how those protests were perceived by Iranian citizens who weren't directly participating. State media portrayed protesters as foreign agents rather than legitimate domestic opposition. Internet filtering systems blocked access to international news coverage while allowing carefully curated domestic reporting. Social media monitoring identified and removed content that could build sympathy for protesters among broader Iranian society. The regime survived 2009 not because they crushed the protests physically, but because they successfully convinced most Iranians that the protests represented foreign interference rather than legitimate domestic grievances. This pattern repeated during subsequent crises with remarkable consistency. When international sanctions devastated Iran's economy between 2012 to 2015, state media successfully attributed economic hardship to external aggression rather than government policy failures. When regional conflicts in Syria and Yemen drained Iranian resources, domestic media portrayed these interventions as defensive actions protecting Iran's borders rather than expensive overseas adventures. During the 2017 to 2018 economic protests, information control again proved decisive. Rather than addressing underlying economic grievances, the regime focused on controlling how those grievances were understood by the broader Iranian population. State media emphasized external manipulation while filtering systems prevented protest coordination through social media platforms. The sophistication reached unprecedented levels by 2020. Iranian information control systems could monitor domestic sentiment in real time, identify emerging opposition narratives before they spread, and deploy counter-messaging within hours. The architecture encompassed everything from traditional media to internet infrastructure, social media monitoring, and domestic surveillance networks designed specifically to maintain regime legitimacy. This system became more important to Iranian state power than oil revenue or military capability. Oil provides financial resources, but information control provides political legitimacy. Military strength deters external threats, but narrative control prevents internal collapse. The Islamic Republic understood that authoritarian governments fall when their own people stop believing in their right to govern, regardless of how much wealth or weaponry they possess. But Iran's information fortress that took 45 years to build is being systematically dismantled in a way that most experts said was impossible. Because while Iran was perfecting their domestic information control, their adversaries were studying something completely different: how to make that control irrelevant. Let me introduce you to what I call the narrative collapse strategy. This represents a fundamental evolution in how sophisticated adversaries target authoritarian governments, and it's brilliant in ways that traditional military strategists are still struggling to understand. The concept is deceptively simple but devastatingly effective. Instead of attacking Iran's military capabilities, economic infrastructure, or leadership directly, the strategy systematically destroys the regime's ability to control what Iranian citizens believe about their own government. The approach recognizes that authoritarian power depends entirely on domestic legitimacy, and domestic legitimacy depends entirely on information control. Destroy the information control, and you destroy the foundation of authoritarian rule without firing a single shot. The strategy operates through three integrated components, each designed to reinforce the others in a cascading failure of regime credibility. First is technical infiltration. This involves systematically compromising the digital infrastructure that enables Iranian information control, not the spectacular cyber attacks that make headlines by shutting down power grids, but surgical penetrations of the specific systems Iran uses to monitor, filter, and control domestic information flow. Here's how it works in practice. Iranian social media monitoring systems rely on automated algorithms that scan platforms like Telegram, Instagram, and domestic networks for opposition content. These algorithms operate from centralized servers that process millions of messages daily, flagging content for human review and potential removal. Intelligence sources confirm that these systems have been systematically penetrated, with algorithms modified to allow opposition content to pass through filtering while appearing to function normally. The technical sophistication is remarkable. Rather than shutting down Iranian monitoring systems completely, which would trigger immediate attention and countermeasures, the penetration creates selective blindness. Systems continue processing most content normally, maintaining the appearance of functionality while systematically missing opposition materials that match specific profiles. Iranian internet filtering systems have experienced similar compromise. These systems normally block Iranian citizens from accessing international news sources, opposition websites, and social media content that challenges regime narratives. But since August, filtering effectiveness has degraded from 94% to approximately 60%, with the degradation occurring in patterns that suggest deliberate manipulation rather than technical failure. Second is content disruption, which exploits technical infiltration to introduce contradictory information directly into Iranian state-controlled information channels. This doesn't mean hacking Iranian television to broadcast opposition programming. It means creating subtle disruptions that allow alternative narratives to reach Iranian audiences through the very systems designed to prevent that access. The Iranian state television glitches I mentioned earlier follow a specific pattern that reveals systematic coordination. During broadcast segments designed to demonstrate government strength, military parades, economic success stories, regional diplomatic victories, technical difficulties interrupt programming precisely when the propaganda impact would be highest. But these aren't random technical failures. Iranian engineers have documented that the interruptions correlate with specific content triggers, not equipment malfunctions. More sophisticated is the selective content bypass occurring across social media platforms. Opposition content that would normally be filtered within hours now remains accessible to Iranian audiences for days or weeks. Internal Revolutionary Guard reporting acknowledges that prohibited materials, including criticism of government economic policies and documentation of protest activities, are reaching domestic audiences at unprecedented levels. The content strategy also includes what intelligence analysts call credibility poisoning. This involves allowing Iranian citizens to discover factual information that directly contradicts official government statements. When Iranian state media claims economic sanctions have minimal impact, citizens can now access real economic data showing dramatic inflation and unemployment figures. When officials announce military victories in regional conflicts, Iranians can access independent reporting revealing actual casualties and strategic setbacks. Third is trust degradation, which uses technical infiltration and content disruption to create systematic doubt about government credibility among Iranian citizens. This component recognizes that authoritarian legitimacy depends on citizens believing their government represents strength, competence, and stability. If citizens begin questioning these fundamental assumptions, the entire foundation of authoritarian rule erodes. Internal polling conducted by Iran's Strategic Council for Foreign Relations reveals the devastating effectiveness of this approach. Government approval ratings have declined from 67% in July to 44% in October, a drop unprecedented in the Islamic Republic's history. But more importantly, polling shows declining trust in government information itself. Only 31% of respondents now consider state media mostly reliable, down from 58% in June. Trust degradation operates through accumulated contradiction rather than dramatic revelation. Iranian citizens don't suddenly discover their government has lied about everything. Instead, they gradually recognize patterns of small deceptions that undermine confidence in official statements. When state media repeatedly claims technical difficulties during segments praising government achievements, citizens begin questioning whether those achievements exist. When internet filtering systems obviously fail to block content they're supposed to block, citizens lose confidence in government technological competence. The psychological impact compounds over time. Citizens who begin questioning government statements about domestic issues start questioning official positions on international affairs, economic policy, and regional conflicts. Trust erosion spreads across all government messaging, creating what intelligence analysts call a legitimacy crisis, where authorities lose the ability to shape public opinion regardless of the accuracy of their statements. This represents a fundamental shift in how sophisticated adversaries challenge authoritarian governments. Traditional approaches focused on military pressure, economic sanctions, or leadership targeting, all of which could actually strengthen authoritarian regimes by creating external threats that justify domestic repression and united populations against foreign enemies. The narrative collapse strategy creates the opposite dynamic. Instead of providing external justification for authoritarian control, it systematically undermines the internal legitimacy that makes authoritarian control possible. Citizens don't rally around a government they no longer trust, regardless of external threats. The strategy is more devastating than conventional military targeting precisely because it attacks the foundation of authoritarian power rather than its symptoms. Destroying Iranian missile sites eliminates specific military capabilities, but doesn't change the fundamental relationship between the Iranian government and Iranian citizens. Compromising Iranian information control systems changes that relationship permanently by preventing the regime from managing domestic narratives that justify its continued rule. Iranian officials understand exactly what's happening, which is why their responses reveal genuine panic rather than typical defiant rhetoric. Rather than dismissing opposition activities as foreign manipulation, the standard authoritarian response, Iranian authorities are implementing increasingly desperate measures to restore information control, including broader internet restrictions that damage their own economic interests. This is why Iranian officials have stopped appearing on international media and why domestic approval ratings are showing patterns the regime has never seen before. Because when authoritarian governments lose the ability to control domestic narratives, they lose everything that makes them capable of governing. And this campaign isn't just affecting Iranian domestic politics, it's fundamentally changing how regional powers think about warfare itself. The information warfare campaign against Iran isn't just another intelligence operation. It represents a fundamental transformation in how regional powers compete. And every major government from Beijing to Riyadh is studying the Iranian model with intense interest because they recognize it changes the entire strategic landscape. What makes this approach revolutionary is that it delivers the strategic benefits of military action without triggering the costs of military retaliation. Traditional military strikes against Iranian facilities would prompt immediate escalation, potentially drawing the entire region into broader conflict. Information warfare achieves regime weakening while maintaining plausible deniability and avoiding the escalation dynamics that make conventional military actions so risky. The strategic advantages are multiple and compounding. First, successful information warfare forces authoritarian governments to allocate enormous resources to internal control rather than external threats. Iran has redirected millions of dollars originally budgeted for regional military operations toward domestic information monitoring and internet infrastructure hardening. Revolutionary Guard units previously deployed in Syria and Yemen are being recalled to manage domestic information security. This resource reallocation creates a strategic trap. The more Iran invests in domestic information control, the less capability it retains for regional influence operations. But if Iran doesn't invest in information defense, the domestic legitimacy erosion continues accelerating. Either choice weakens Iran's regional position while strengthening its adversaries. Second, information warfare creates exploitation opportunities for allied governments without requiring direct cooperation. As Iranian domestic approval ratings decline and information control systems fail, allied governments can amplify the effects through diplomatic messaging, economic coordination, and regional alliance building that exploits Iranian weakness without appearing to coordinate attacks on Iranian sovereignty. Saudi Arabia has already begun emphasizing Iranian domestic instability in diplomatic communications with regional partners, positioning itself as the stable alternative for regional leadership. The UAE has increased economic outreach to Iranian business communities, specifically during periods when Iranian government credibility appears most compromised. These governments aren't directly participating in information warfare against Iran, but they're strategically exploiting its effects. The international implications extend far beyond the Middle East. Chinese Communist Party leadership has initiated comprehensive reviews of domestic information control systems, specifically in response to the Iranian example. Internal Chinese government documents obtained by intelligence services reveal serious concern about potential vulnerabilities in Chinese social media monitoring, internet filtering, and domestic surveillance infrastructure. Russia has accelerated development of what they call information sovereignty capabilities designed to isolate Russian domestic information networks from foreign penetration. Russian investment in domestic internet infrastructure has increased 340% since September, with priority given to systems that can operate independently of international networks if necessary. But perhaps most significantly, democratic governments are developing information warfare capabilities as alternatives to military intervention. The Iranian case demonstrates that information operations can achieve strategic objectives, weakening authoritarian adversaries, reducing their regional influence, creating domestic pressure for policy change without the enormous financial, political, and human costs of military action. This represents a fundamental shift in how democracies project power. Rather than choosing between ineffective sanctions and costly military interventions, democratic governments now have a third option that can deliver strategic results while maintaining public support and international legitimacy. Information warfare operations are cheaper than military campaigns, create fewer diplomatic complications than economic sanctions, and can achieve regime change objectives without direct confrontation. The emergence of information warfare as a primary tool of regional competition is reshaping alliance structures in unprecedented ways. Traditional military alliances focused on collective defense against conventional threats. Information warfare requires different capabilities and creates different vulnerabilities that existing alliance frameworks weren't designed to address. NATO members are discovering that Article 5 collective defense provisions don't clearly apply to information attacks that don't cross traditional definitions of military aggression. If a member nation's domestic information control systems are systematically compromised by another state, does that trigger collective defense obligations? The question reveals how information warfare challenges fundamental assumptions about alliance solidarity and mutual defense. Regional partnerships are adapting faster than formal alliances. Gulf Cooperation Council members have begun sharing information warfare defense capabilities and coordinating responses to information attacks. The arrangement operates through intelligence sharing rather than treaty obligations, allowing more flexible responses to information threats while avoiding the legal complications of formal military cooperation. Information warfare is also changing diplomatic negotiations by altering the fundamental power dynamics between negotiating parties. When one side's domestic legitimacy is under systematic attack, traditional diplomatic leverage calculations become unreliable. Iranian negotiators in regional diplomatic processes now operate under the constraint that any agreement they sign could be undermined by domestic credibility erosion, regardless of its strategic merit. Regional powers are recognizing that information warfare capabilities represent a new form of strategic deterrence. Countries with advanced information warfare capabilities can threaten authoritarian adversaries with domestic legitimacy destruction, potentially preventing conflicts before they begin. But this deterrence only works against governments that depend on domestic approval, creating asymmetric vulnerabilities that favor democratic systems over authoritarian ones. But Iran isn't just defending against this campaign. They're developing their own information warfare capabilities to strike back in ways that could destabilize the entire region. Which brings us to the most dangerous question. How do you defend against an enemy that's attacking your population's trust in your own government? Iran now faces 4 possible strategic responses to the systematic erosion of their domestic information control, and every single option carries devastating trade-offs that reveal just how sophisticated this campaign has been. Option 1 is information isolation, essentially cutting Iran off from global internet infrastructure to prevent further information contamination. Iranian hardliners within the Revolutionary Guard have advocated for what they call digital sovereignty, creating a domestic internet system that operates independently of international networks. China successfully implemented a version of this approach, and Iran possesses the technical capability to follow suit. But the economic cost would be catastrophic. Iran's economy depends heavily on international digital commerce, banking networks, and communication systems that require global internet connectivity. Intelligence assessments suggest that comprehensive internet isolation would reduce Iranian GDP by approximately 15 to 20% within the first year, creating domestic economic pressure that could trigger the very legitimacy crisis the isolation was designed to prevent. Moreover, complete digital isolation would severely limit Iranian government functionality. Modern administrative systems, military communications, and diplomatic operations rely on international connectivity. Iran would essentially be trading information security for economic and governmental capacity at a moment when the regime can afford to lose neither. Option 2 is counter-information warfare, developing sophisticated capabilities to attack enemy domestic information systems in retaliation. Iranian cyber units have been studying the campaign against their own systems and attempting to reverse engineer similar capabilities for deployment against Israeli, American, and Gulf state domestic information infrastructure. Early Iranian attempts reveal both the potential and the risks of this approach. Revolutionary Guard cyber units successfully penetrated social media monitoring systems used by Bahraini authorities in October, allowing opposition content to reach Bahraini domestic audiences for several days before the breach was discovered and repaired. But the operation exposed Iranian cyber signatures that enabled foreign intelligence services to develop better defenses against future Iranian information operations. Counter-information warfare also risks escalation dynamics that Iran may not be prepared to manage. If Iran successfully destabilizes domestic information control in multiple adversary countries simultaneously, it could trigger coordinated retaliation that overwhelms Iranian defensive capabilities. The result would be an information warfare arms race that heavily favors countries with more advanced digital infrastructure and greater cyber resources. Option 3 is conventional escalation, responding to information attacks with traditional military strikes. Iranian military leadership has argued that information warfare represents an attack on Iranian sovereignty equivalent to physical aggression, justifying military retaliation against the sources of information operations. This approach carries enormous risks with limited potential benefits. Military strikes would provide definitive proof of Iranian weakness rather than strength, demonstrating that the regime cannot defend itself through the same digital means being used against it. Moreover, conventional escalation would likely trigger broader regional conflict at a moment when Iran's domestic legitimacy is already compromised, potentially creating a two-front crisis that the regime cannot survive. Option 4 is domestic legitimacy rebuilding, attempting to restore government credibility through genuine policy changes, economic reforms, and political adaptation. This approach recognizes that the most effective defense against information warfare is eliminating the underlying conditions that make opposition messaging credible to domestic audiences. But legitimacy rebuilding requires acknowledging government failures that Iranian authorities have consistently denied, potentially accelerating the very credibility erosion the reforms are designed to address. Moreover, meaningful reforms would require power-sharing arrangements with domestic opposition groups that hardline elements within the Revolutionary Guard consider existential threats to the Islamic Republic's foundational structure. The most likely scenario combines elements of all four responses in what intelligence analysts are calling an information warfare arms race. Iran will implement partial internet restrictions while developing limited counter-information capabilities and pursuing selective domestic reforms, creating a complex regional dynamic where multiple governments simultaneously attack and defend against information operations. This arms race scenario creates unprecedented regional instability, because information warfare attacks the domestic legitimacy that authoritarian governments require to maintain control. Unlike conventional military conflicts that typically strengthen domestic support for existing governments, information warfare inherently weakens all participating authoritarian regimes by exposing their vulnerabilities and limitations to their own populations. Regional powers are already adapting to this new reality. Saudi Arabia has accelerated development of domestic information monitoring systems while increasing investment in regional media influence operations. The UAE has strengthened cyber defense capabilities while expanding information operations targeting Iranian and Turkish domestic audiences. Even traditional democracies like Israel are developing information warfare capabilities designed to exploit authoritarian vulnerabilities without triggering conventional military responses. But several wildcard factors could fundamentally alter these calculations. First, information warfare operations could accidentally trigger conventional military conflicts if targeted governments misinterpret digital attacks as preparation for physical attacks. Iranian military doctrine assumes that cyber operations targeting critical infrastructure typically precede military strikes, creating hair-trigger escalation risks. Second, non-state actors with advanced information warfare capabilities could exploit regional conflicts for their own objectives. Terrorist organizations, criminal networks, and opposition groups possess digital tools that were previously available only to state intelligence services, creating unpredictable variables in information conflicts between governments. Most dangerously, successful information campaigns against Iran could encourage similar operations against other authoritarian governments globally, creating worldwide instability as information warfare spreads beyond regional conflicts to global competition between democratic and authoritarian systems. But there's one scenario that's more dangerous than an information warfare arms race, and it's the one that intelligence services are quietly preparing for right now. Because the real question isn't whether Iran can defend against information warfare. The question is whether any authoritarian government can maintain power when its own people stop believing what it tells them. So let me return to where we started, because the central revelation of the past 6 months exposes everything you need to understand about warfare in the digital age. While military analysts debated conventional targets, nuclear facilities, missile sites, Revolutionary Guard command centers, the most sophisticated campaign in decades was systematically dismantling Iran's domestic legitimacy through surgical attacks on information control systems. Everyone was looking for the wrong kind of target entirely. This represents a fundamental shift in how states compete and project power. Traditional conflict focused on territorial control, resource denial, and military capability destruction. Information warfare moves beyond geography to narrative control, recognizing that modern governments derive power not from what they can destroy, but from what their own populations believe about their legitimacy and competence. The Iranian case demonstrates that authoritarian governments are inherently more vulnerable to information campaigns than democratic systems, because their power depends entirely on domestic population acceptance without institutional mechanisms for peaceful power transfer. When authoritarian legitimacy erodes, there are no constitutional processes to manage the crisis. The result is either successful adaptation or regime collapse, with very limited middle ground. Democratic governments face information challenges but possess institutional resilience that authoritarian systems lack. Opposition parties, free media, and civil society organizations provide pressure valves that allow democratic systems to adapt to legitimacy crises without fundamental collapse. Authoritarian governments lacking these mechanisms become brittle when domestic trust erodes. What we're witnessing in Iran isn't an isolated intelligence operation, it's the emergence of information warfare as the primary tool of strategic competition between sophisticated adversaries. The most devastating attacks on governments no longer target buildings, infrastructure, or military hardware. They target the trust between governments and their own citizens, recognizing that governmental power in the modern world depends entirely on domestic legitimacy. This changes everything about regional security calculations. Military balance remains important for deterring conventional aggression, but long-term stability increasingly depends on information warfare capabilities and domestic legitimacy resilience. Countries with sophisticated information, defense systems, and strong domestic trust enjoy strategic advantages that cannot be measured in missile counts or military budgets. The future of international competition will be determined less by who builds the most advanced weapons than by who can maintain domestic legitimacy while systematically undermining adversary governments' relationships with their own populations. The newest target in Iran wasn't a building that could be rebuilt or a leader who could be replaced. It was something far more fundamental, the trust that holds authoritarian governments together. And once that trust is systematically destroyed, no amount of military capability can restore it.